Hi Aditya.
Hi, Sushil.
Yeah, hi. I'll just make you co-host, and if you have a presentation or something, you could just check if it's running.
I won't be running a presentation today. I decided not to do that.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I'll still make you.
Sure.
So you wouldn't need any co-host permissions.
No, don't
Okay,
need it.
right. So are you feeling better now?
Yeah, better. If I clear my throat or if I cough, I'm really sorry. It's been a long residual impact of that flu. Uh, a little unusual actually, but yeah, much better. Thanks. Sorry, I got a couple of minutes delayed. I wanted to be here 5 minutes earlier, but
No, no, you are well in time, so please don't worry.
just give me a second.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm good to go whenever you are.
Wait a couple of minutes and
Yeah.
let's start. So the format is very simple. I think I mentioned we typically have 30, 40 minutes, whatever is your convenience, and then we'll have a Q&A. We try to restrict it to 1 hour, but then if there are questions and you are free, probably it could go beyond by 5, 10 minutes max.
Yeah, sure. I'm free. I mean, I have nothing after this in the evening, so I'm happy to spend time.
Great. And are you in Canada right now?
No, currently I'm in Pune, so I'll be here in fact for another 2 months.
Okay.
So September end, I head back to Canada.
Right. Nice.
Of course, I will thank you again, but thanks, Sushil, just to start things off for having me on. Um, really excited to share this with people and hopefully get some discussion going on this topic.
Yeah, no, thanks for agreeing to do this talk. It's great to have you.
Thanks.
Just wait for a minute more in case there are others who are joining us. All right, I think we'll start. So welcome everyone to this third talk in the series. The whole idea of the talk is simply to introduce exciting new work that is coming in philosophy to audiences, both academic and general. So today we are glad to have Dr. Aditya Nayan with us. Dr. Nayan is an investment consultant with expertise in North American and Indian investments and is visiting faculty for philosophy and logic at Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts and Flame University. He has taught an undergraduate course on the philosophy of money since 2012 and holds a PhD from IIT Bombay. His ongoing research is focused on the conceptual understanding of money and value, including contemporary innovations such as Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So very excited to hear Dr. Nayan address us. Over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Sushruth. Thank you so much for having me on to talk about our work. Of course, thank you to the larger philosophical community that's here to spend time today. And I see some familiar, well, not faces because the video is off, but familiar names. So hello to them as well. All right. So, of course, firstly, this book, which is Understanding Money, Philosophical Frameworks of Monetary Value, is written jointly by me and Dr. Jung, Dr. P.G. Jung, who was, of course, my PhD guide supervisor at IIT Bombay from 2013 to 2018. I ended. And in fact, the ideas that are presented in this book, I think, reached their maturity. Most of these ideas reached their maturity between 2015 and 2018. So although we published the book in 2021 with Routledge, um, it was, these ideas are in fact have been swimming around in our heads and in my head even before that, um, for a long time, a number of years. And so in fact, some of these, I have to rehash and relook at some of these ideas to refresh my own memory. And then, of course, we reworked and sharpened the book up for publication, and it's available, of course, on Amazon. So I hope that people will be interested enough to go pick one up or get in touch with me. All right. So I'm going to commit the cardinal sin of partially reading and partially talking, but I'll try and make it as less boring as possible. I decided not to have a PPT because I find it awkward to have a document and a PPT on these online sessions. Okay, so the book starts off with the premise that the philosophical discourse on monetary value has largely been marginalized. Of course, not discourse on money, but philosophical discourse on money. And in the book, we argue that there are basically two primary reasons, and these are historical reasons for this. Now, the first is the fact, and it's a historical accident really, that the philosophy of money was launched by Aristotle. Um, and Aristotle, in the very structure of his thought, ended up limiting the scope that philosophers would, the scope with which philosophers would look into money, because he restricted it basically to the domain of ethics and politics. Now, while those are, of course, valid and important in their own right, um, it stifled thought in other philosophical aspects of money and monetary value. And we make the distinction between the two things. So this move by Aristotle, which is to restrict it to ethics and politics, resulted in the general philosophical treatment of monetary value as being sidelined as unnecessary. So maybe important from an ethical perspective, but what's really there about money to think so much about? At the most, it's a necessary evil. That's the idea, the strain that's been there as part of the dominant schools of philosophy. The second major reason for this sidelining of the philosophy of money was the emergence of the scientific paradigm. So this, we're talking the 1700s, so the 18th century, in, of course, the European Enlightenment, with the emergence of economic thought as a science. So, of course, we've had economic thought in the ancient times as well in various traditions, but the science of economics is what we're specifically talking about. Now, within the framework of economics, monetary value was seen as being the sole concern of economics, or rather solely the concern of economics and not of philosophy. So just like physics was hived off into the physics department, leaving natural philosophy to think about its past, and just like politics got a department of its own with Hobbes and Locke and people after that, a couple of centuries after that. In the same way, economics and money started to get its own department, taking it out of philosophy. So notwithstanding this marginalization, though, there has in fact been philosophical work on money and monetary value within the history of philosophy. However, this work has largely been in the field of ethics and not ontology. So there's a lot of material, really good material out there on ethics, and of course, the theology of money going back to early Christian, systematic Christian thought. Although there's largely been an increase in non-ethical discourse on money within philosophy departments, it's yet to hit the mainstream. So our book is not about the ethics or the politics of money. And while these are questions that we are interested in and we do discuss, and we have the plan to publish more on this, we haven't tackled these in the current book that we're talking about. Now, the space for an ontological treatment of monetary value, which is what we're concerned with in this book, is possible despite economics and along with economics. Just like you can have the philosophy of psychology, or you can have the philosophy of economics itself, or you can have the philosophy of God or the philosophy of literature, while you have specific domains that treat of all these things in their own right as well. So the mere existence of economics does not foreclose the possibility for non-economic treatment of monetary value. At the same time, the philosophical treatment of monetary value does not replace and neither does it dislodge its treatment within economics. So, in fact, as we've argued in the book, the economic paradigm presupposes certain philosophical or conceptual aspects of monetary value. In the same way that a school of physics would presuppose certain ideas about the nature of the material world. Of course, one can divorce and distinguish between the two of them, but certain presuppositions are, of course, there for us to pinpoint. Now, these presuppositions about monetary value themselves make the philosophy of money possible, and in fact, we would say makes it necessary. And in Deweyan words, we need to take our clothes off and inspect them every now and then. So our book is an attempt at inspecting the presuppositions that we are wearing, so to speak, in our daily discourse in money. Thus, while economics is bound by the conceptual presuppositions that constitute its own theoretical paradigm, the science of economics, the philosophy of money does not have these constraints, as of course any good philosophy shouldn't. But this is, of course, both a blessing and a curse, just like it is with physics or with psychology or any other scientific domain. Because sometimes philosophy makes statements that seem to be completely out of step with the latest empirical research. But at the same time, we want philosophy to make an attempt to deal with all these issues. So the space for philosophy may be understood in contradistinction to what we see as the approach taken by economics, which is primarily to investigate the empirical behavior of money within monetary systems. So economics will take up certain aspects of the economy, for instance, monetary policy, and it will try to understand the effect of interest rates on asset prices, for instance. Right now, I'm a market economics guy, which is why I think of those, but you can think of any domain of economics and pick your example. Philosophy, of course, does not do this because it's not concerned with the objects that represent money. That means empirical manifestations of monetary value. And it's not concerned with investigations into their behavior. These are the proper subject of science. Rather, the philosophy of monetary value is concerned with the examination and, in our case, construction. So both the examination and construction of conceptual frameworks, conceptual being the operative word, that underlie an empirical investigation. So you have monetary systems, you have empirical investigations through the sciences into monetary systems, and then you have a philosophical examination of those presuppositions that underlie these empirical systems. And you can also build conceptual systems, as we do in the book, to offer a fresh perspective on the foundational concepts of money and monetary value. So philosophy, therefore, serves the purpose of critically examining the implicit conceptual frameworks that underlie empirical paradigms, while at the same time reimagining and recreating alternative conceptual frameworks for understanding monetary value. So, of course, nothing new here for those people who are used to being philosophy of X or philosophy of Y. Now, unlike economics, which deals with parts of monetary reality, philosophical frameworks are constituted by conceptual abstractions. And this is something we're very careful to emphasize in the book, that whatever system of concepts of framework we may espouse or we may offer, and however much we may use the term ontology, we're always sure that we don't mean an old world type of objective mirroring ontology, but more an ontology that is built up of epistemic abstractions or conceptual abstractions. Now, this being the case, all philosophical frameworks of monetary value, including the one developed in the present book, are, using Barlingay's terminology, anthropocentric constructs. Or in Deweyan terms, our framework is not positivistic or didactic in its assertions, but it's a map of monetary reality, and as such is justified not in terms of its ability to mirror monetary reality, but in its success in allowing us to make sense of various monetary systems. And that's something we tackle in the last couple of chapters of the book. So that's to say that the philosophical framework of monetary value developed by us cannot lay claim to mirroring reality because, well, monetary reality is man-made, firstly, or human-made. And secondly, even our conceptual constructs about monetary reality are conceptual abstractions. So we have to move away from the mirroring framework. So since concept formation is a social and historical process, a philosophy of monetary value must account for the social and historical realities of money. Therefore, while the constructive part of the book does in fact develop a constructivist ontology of monetary value, that is, an epistemic framework for understanding monetary value, we emphasize that this framework is an anthropocentric construction and, to be philosophically tenable, must itself be subject to progressive revisions in light of any empirical changes or innovations in monetary systems. So, having recognized the anthropocentric and constructivist nature of all ontological frameworks, of course, this is our contention, people may disagree with it, and having identified the necessary features of a philosophically robust framework, our book offers an interpretation of the history of the philosophy of money and monetary value. So, this exercise in the history of the philosophy of money is undertaken in order to show a couple of things, but most importantly, that why we need what we call a constructivist paradigm for understanding monetary value, and why the traditional approach taken from Aristotle to Smith, Marx, and beyond fails to offer this paradigm to us, and how it, because of its theoretical structure itself, would not be able to do so. So the part of a book which offers a novel approach to understanding money, so the part of the book that talks about the history of money, which constitutes chapters 3 to 11, is not merely an exposition or a survey of philosophical thought on money, but rather it's a sustained interpretative argument about why the historical tradition fails, in our view, to give rise to a constructivist framework for monetary value rather than an objectivist substantive framework. Because since I'm talking to a philosophical audience, I won't dwell too much on the meanings of those terms, although we can discuss our specific meanings in the Q&A. So we argue in the book that in the reliance on the barter narrative as an extension on some particular historical theory of the development of money that constrains the development of the kind of epistemic framework. So what we're saying here is that what we call the theoretical mistake, to put it very crudely, that is created or committed by the traditional framework can be traced to its understanding of the history of money by its whole-scale acceptance of the barter narrative, which for the most part has been discredited, although some people still do accept it. It has been discredited by the work done primarily by the credit or debt theorists of money. So in fact, rather than develop a constructivist framework, the tradition consistently works within what we've characterized as the substantive essentialist paradigm. So the substantive essentialist paradigm, taken from Aristotle's book 2 of his Politics, basically locates the source of monetary value in an unchanging ontological realm and distinguishes this unchanging substratum of value from the changing flux of market values. And this gave rise to what in the tradition came to be the price value distinction. But the price value distinction, which economics is very familiar with, we argue is an adopting and an adaptation of Aristotelian metaphysics and Aristotle's distinction between substantive reality and appearance, which of course we can trace back to Plato as well. So when Aristotle is concerned with money, he's really concerned with money from the perspective of ethics and politics. But one of the arguments we make in the book is that, in fact, if you dig deeper, his ethics and political statements about money have a grounding in his ontology and his larger ontology, so to speak, so his metaphysics. But it has a grounding in one very specific phase of his ontology, which is that of the categories, which of course is one of his earlier works. That's what historical analysis tells us. And if we look deeper into what Aristotle was basing his ethics and politics on, we find that it was the metaphysics or the ontology which we saw in his categories, the work. So we argue that the paradigm which Aristotle has for money, this duality between substantive and empirical reality, is the result of Aristotle presenting the barter narrative as though it were a historical fact rather than as conjecture or a hypothesis of the development of money. And we present this argument in the book, but I don't want to get into the details of that right now. But essentially, this notion of the barter narrative, once accepted, leads Aristotle to define money teleologically as a medium of exchange. So the famous notion of money being a medium of exchange can be ascribed to Aristotle's teleology. Why? Because Aristotle thought of it this way: if you have two commodities that have to be bartered, well then, maybe there needs to be a better system. And so there is what the modern tradition calls the double coincidence of wants, which is an issue which leads to the rising of money. Now, money essentially functions as a between commodity A and commodity B. And so Aristotle says, well, that third commodity, which functions as a go-between, has a telos, and its telos is being a medium of exchange. So that commodity, the third commodity, being the medium of exchange, is the money commodity. Right? So this is where we get our notion of money being a medium of exchange. Now, this follows from his construal of money being the go-between that facilitates the exchange of one commodity for another. Now, having defined money as a medium of exchange, Aristotle argues that there must be an object that facilitates this medium of exchange. And he argues that since a function, that means being an exchange medium, so think of medium of exchange as a function, and think of the object that serves that function as being money. Aristotle, using his ontology of the categories, of course, has to say that because substance is more primary than function, the object that serves the purpose of being the medium of exchange has primacy over its function of being a medium of exchange. And this is a central point, philosophical point in our work that we highlight, which is that you have to look to ontology if you want to understand why economics takes money to be a medium of exchange, and why there has been a fixation on objects or commodities, right to Marx and later, as being the primary mediums of exchange. Okay, so Aristotle comes up with this distinction between exchange value and use value. And he says, well, okay, so if a shoe is to function as money, then a shoe can only function as money if it's useful. And so the substratum, the ontological level on which value can be found in the shoe, is in its use as a shoe. Of course, we can then ascribe exchange value to it and use it as money. But fundamentally, he says there's a distinction between exchange value and use value. And this is the dichotomy that he then takes and becomes in the modern scientific or political economic phase of the price value distinction in Smith, and of course most emphatically in Ricardo. And we emphasize Ricardo a lot because Ricardo is the midpoint between Adam Smith and Karl Marx, both. So Ricardo takes off from Adam Smith, but if you read Marx, Marx also sees Ricardo as the culmination, as the clearest example and manifestation of that political economic tradition. Right. So what we want to emphasize in our historical interpretation is that our current thought about money, the dominant strain, which we call the substantive way of looking at money, owes its origin to Aristotle's ontology as seen in the categories, because of the primacy he gives to the category of substance, and therefore gives a lower level of reality, so to speak, to relationality and to functionality. And this is important for the later part, because when we give our own constructive framework, we adopt a multi-categorical approach in which we resurrect and sort of adapt and adopt the categories of all three: substantive, the relational, and the functional. And this is seen in chapters, I think, 11 or 12 to 14 of our book. And in fact, when a lot of people talk about the scientific revolution or the rise of economics, let's say in the 18th and 19th centuries, they often make a distinction between the political economists or the classical political economists, Ricardo, etc., and their critics, which is, of course, the most famous being Marx. But in our book, what we've tried to do is to show, and we're not the only people to show this, not the first people either, that in fact, Marx, Smith, and Ricardo, although different in certain important ways, are yet under the same substantive umbrella which they get from Aristotle. So Marx's most fundamental philosophical convictions with regard to how he thinks about value is Aristotelian in its essence. And in fact, when the labor theory of value arises, much before Marx, of course, but then it's propounded, I think, most sharply by Smith, Ricardo, and then, of course, most emphatically by Marx. What Marx does is pick up the labor theory of value already present in Ricardo and then takes it a different direction. He takes it to a direction that allows him to make his socio-political arguments. But this would not have been possible, we argue, without the Aristotelian tradition and its substantive emphasis. Because what the labor theorists of value do is they go a step deeper than Aristotle and say, wait, okay, so Aristotle is right that there has to be unchanging substantive monetary value, but this is not to be found in coins. This is not to be found in any other monetary objects. It's not even to be found in the metal like gold that makes up coins in an earlier time, but in fact, it's to be found in labor. And we give the more detailed argument about this earlier, but although Marx and the other labor theorists shift the emphasis, they still maintain they displace the location of the ontological value. They still hold that ontological value is valid and that it's distinct from empirical value. And therefore, this radical dichotomy that exists between the two still stands. Now, we have an issue with this in the book, with the entire tradition. And so in the middle part of the book, what we do is offer an argument against the substantive tradition. And at the foundations of this argument is basically the view that there are a couple of problems, but the basic philosophical problem is of self-referentiality. That means if something is intrinsically valuable, then how does it acquire its value? Now, of course, from our perspective, this is a philosophical problem, but from Aristotle's perspective, this is absolutely natural because for him, eudaimonia is also intrinsically valuable in a way. But we present arguments of why we think this is an issue. And of course, this is not the first place in philosophy where you see this. It's also the problem with Cartesian duality. It's a problem with the ancient Greek, with the Milesian distinction between empirical reality and metaphysical reality. And so it's just a replaying of the same metaphysical arguments in the context of money. Now, I won't go into certain details about in the middle of the book about the history of money, but there were a couple of interventions in which we do see relational and function-based thinking coming into money. And I'll throw a few names out. Samuel Bailey wrote in 1825 a book on value, a much sort of ignored thinker, in which Bailey presents an argument against the substantive notion of value and presents his arguments for relationality. And Bailey's wonderful insight was that just like distance is a relational concept where you cannot describe distance without describing this distance from one thing to another. So it requires two points in space. Similarly, money is relational in that you cannot ascribe value or price to something without talking about it in comparison to something else. So money is always relational for Bailey. But still, Bailey does not offer us a proper substantive framework to build on. So the place that we really depart from the tradition, or the thinker that gives us the impetus to depart from the tradition is Simmel, Georg Simmel, known most famously as a sociologist, but also an important philosopher. And of course, in the tradition, the most important philosopher of money. So in 1900, Simmel published The Philosophy of Money in German, in which he moves away from the substantive tradition. And he notes that apart from all the arguments he gives, this is, of course, not an accident, but this comes out of the traditional substantive search for a basis, a search for a metaphysical land, so to speak, that we can stand on. And of course, those familiar with Heraclitus or Nietzsche would be very familiar with this, something that, we're not comfortable with this notion of instability, of empirical flux. And so we posit a reality beyond that. And he ascribes the substantive tradition to having done so for this psychological reason. Now, what I will do, because we are running out of time and I don't want to unnecessarily stretch it, is I'll give you a little bit of an idea of what we propose. Now, in the final 3 chapters of our book, we present what we call a constructivist framework. Now, the constructivist framework for monetary value is essentially an adoption of the 3 categories that we spoke about in a multi-categorical formal framework for understanding monetary value, which means we wanted to present a framework that would be philosophical in a sense of being a generic description of not just one monetary theory or not just one monetary reality or system, but one which is amenable to explaining and describing various monetary theories or systems. So whether it's the Bitcoin system or the gold standard or the modern bank-based monetary systems, we wanted a framework that could do all of these. And what we came up with is what we call a little, we don't like this phrase, but we couldn't come up with anything else earlier. It was called the formal complex. So it's a multi-categorical complex of concepts, which of course we have constructed through the use of categories, where we talk about money from a substantive aspect, as well as its relational and functional aspect. So we hold, for instance, that if one were to really try and understand the current bank-based monetary system, then you would have to look at not only the physical notes and coins that we use, those would be one instantiation of substantiveness within the system, but you would also have to recognize the central bank as one discrete instantiation of substanceness. You would also have to recognize the commercial banking system and various other aspects. So in our system, each discrete entity of the monetary system is recognized as its substantiveness, but then there must be a specific way in which, let's say, central banks interact with commercial banks. So there must be a determinate relationality between the two of them. And there must be a certain way in which physical notes and coins interact with commercial banks. And there must be limiting factors. So we have the substances, the discrete elements. We have the relatedness in the way in which these substances are related to each other. And then we have the function. That means how we describe the function that these substances have in relation to each other. So what's the function, for instance, of the central bank with regard to the commercial banks? Put very simply, the central bank is the regulator of commercial banks. And this is both a limiting factor, but also gives the rise to possibilities of how these entities will interact with each other through what we call rules of interaction. Now, all this, of course, is abstract. It's meant to be abstract in the sense that if it were not generic and formal, then it would be an exercise in economics, because then we would have to specifically talk about only one monetary system, and we would then have to describe just one monetary system. What we wanted to do was come up with a system which we believe we can, although it can be reworked and bettered. It can answer questions like, is Bitcoin money? How is Bitcoin money? Why is it money? Or if not, what are the issues that arise and what should we think about? So what I'll do is, and I've skipped through a bunch of things, but I'd rather talk more in terms of questions rather than didactically or go on. If you'll allow me to just read a quick passage from the book, I'll end with that and then we can take it forward. So why we want a constructive framework? So this is on chapter 15, page 123. We say, so in enabling us to map monetary systems in a more comprehensive manner, our framework does not merely engender a better understanding of particular monetary systems, but also equips us to address some contentious and philosophically pertinent questions that emerge as a consequence of, let's say, monetary innovation, metamorphoses, or crises. After all, pertinent present-day questions such as, Does Bitcoin have intrinsic value? Are cryptocurrencies really money? Is private money, such as Facebook's project now shut, but Facebook's project called Libra, in fact, money? Is money naturally limited, or is it only artificially so? Does money necessarily have to be based on a scarce commodity like gold or Bitcoin? Or is scarcity merely an accidental quality of the particular historical configuration of monetary value? Can digital money be real, or must it be based on convertible to something else? Are all fundamentally hinged precisely on how we describe and characterize money itself. All of these questions and the debates surrounding them arise when our description of money or monetary value fails to adequately account for some manifestation of monetary value that defies the bounds of our description of money that we currently work with. So I'll end with that and hope that I've generated some amount of interest in it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Aditya. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, please raise your hands and I'll unmute you. Right. Yeah. Professor Jillian.
Hi, Aditya. Thank you so much for a very interesting and provocative talk. So I want to end. So I want to start where you ended. So really asking you, how would you define money? Because of course, money as a unit of exchange. There are other definitions of money as well. So do you, for instance, store of value, so on and so forth. So do you define money as a combination of all of these, or do you fall on one side of the spectrum?
Okay, thank you. Should I go ahead and answer that?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for that question. In fact, in chapter 15, we do offer a definition, and I'll give you that definition. But before I say that, one of the important shifts that we make is from asking what's the source of monetary value to how can we best describe monetary value. And we think this is a key distinction, because often when a lot of the traditional thinkers have thought that they're defining money, what they've been doing is trying to identify the source of money. So let's say someone will say money is debt. Someone will say money is the fiat of the state. Someone will say money is commodity. The three big theories. And this is really an identification with the source. So what we are saying is the definition needs to be generic, which is of course the great usefulness of definitions. And so here's what we have. And this is an adaptation of a definition that Felix Martin gives in his book, Money and Unauthorized Biography. We've adapted that and changed it up. So there are three necessary sufficient conditions. So yeah, it should be an abstract quantitative unit of value. That's the first. Second is it should be transferable. So whatever it is, it should be transferable. And third, that this transfer, in terms of its positionality, must be trackable so that it can be translated into a unit of account. Now, you can see that we're taking various aspects from the tradition. And of course, the three definitions that you mentioned are all in Aristotle's Politics. So from Aristotle's Politics and Ethics, that's how we get all the definitions, two especially. And the third and fourth you can tease out of there. So I'll leave it there, I won't go on too much into that, but we have this on page 131. In a recent review of our book, this definition was criticized. It's got me to thinking a little bit more about it, and so I may take a relook at it, but we have it for people to critique.
I have some more questions, but I think maybe we can just do a move around the table and come back.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Chakrabarti? You're on mute. We cannot hear you, sorry.
Yeah, let me unmute myself. Yeah. Hi, Aditya, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Dr. Gillette and I, we are going to teach sociology of money in the coming semester.
Lovely. Okay.
And your book would be, I think we are going to definitely read your book.
Lovely.
So I just have a few comments. And I'm actually editing a book with Barbara Harris White, which is on sociology of gold.
Okay.
So we are in the process of doing that, and your book would be
Very interesting.
interesting to look at. Yeah.
Yeah.
My only point was that when you read Labor Theory of Value in Capital Volume 1, I would, as a sociologist, pitch in a little more for Marx in terms of looking at it as functional and relational.
Yeah.
Because when if you look at the trajectory from barter to paper money, how he takes his reader through it, I think we can give him a little more credit as somebody who would be in the relational school. But I think the questions that you have posed in the end are very, very critical. We look forward to more conversations. I had another kind of related question that, so I'm doing some other work on moral economy, looking at religion and the economy. And one of the things have been kind of intriguing me is the question of interest, when money begets money. And it has been a moral taboo in almost all religion. And if you look at Islamic banking and all those kind of things in contemporary context. So have you thought about it, or you want to, pursue that?
Sure.
Yeah, these are the things.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It'll be very interesting. In fact, we have a little section on gold specifically. So I can also tell you where that is in the book and how it may relate. So on Marx, yes, our treatment of various thinkers in this book have been summary at best. But we are very aware of the fact, although we will keep our argument and I can defend that, we did that because we would be getting into a completely different domain if we went into where Marx takes it. So there's a lot in Marx that is, of course, not in Aristotle, not in Smith, not in Ricardo, not in anyone before him, which is, of course, very specific to Marx, which is how you could write so many pages. But what we are focusing on is where he gets some of those ideas. And so while even in Smith, there are certain relational aspects, and even in Ricardo, who sort of goes there but comes back, the fundamental distinction, which is you only see in certain sections of their works, specifically in labor theory, is still grounded in Aristotelian ontology, because they all say that, look, we need to get scientific. Marx says that we're doing science. So does Smith, sort of, but Ricardo does for sure. But they all want to ground their science, much in the way that many of the early scientists wanted to find a metaphysical ground. And this metaphysical grounding is what we are pointing to. So that's our limited point with regard to Marx for all the other things that are there in him. With regard to interest, yes, so this is, I don't know, people think, people wonder why I harp on Aristotle so much, but apart from the religious traditions, the money begets money and the offspring of money is literally Aristotelian terminology. And we've spoken a little bit about this in the book and why Aristotle considers it to be unethical. And of course, this flows into Christianity for sure. I'm not too aware of the historical lineage that Islamic banking traces itself back onto, but I'm aware of the tenets. I think this comes out of Aristotle's insistence on money as being a commodity, one, and on this commodity's value being located in its use. And so if its value is located in its use, then ultimately the real reality of that object is its use value, not its exchange value. So exchange value may be a perversion of its use value in Aristotle. And Marx takes that to various extremes, but it is not its ontological reality. And so Aristotle says that while we can technically beget money indefinitely and in a limitless manner, ethically we should not. And so the oughtness of it comes into the picture. Personally, I think that this is based on an understanding of money that I would not subscribe to because of its object centrism and because of its ontological underpinnings. But this goes into an ethical debate of then usury versus legitimate interest. So maybe you want to make a distinction between predatory lending versus just regulated lending. And I think that's where the debate is right now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Chaitanya.
Thank you, Aditya. Hi, nice to see you after a long time. This sort feels like a small get together. Hi, Lalit, Sushruth, and nice to see you all. Yeah, so I always had this question, never got the chance to ask, but I thought this. So it's a very, I mean, maybe a very small observation coming from, philosophy student. I was wondering that you have somehow resisted uh, the use of the word realism or realist while so your sort of framework you call constructivist, Aristotle's essentialist. So I just wanted to know that is that intentional? I mean, was there some? I mean, is there any other implication? Like if I simply, along with calling Aristotelian framework essentialist, I call it realist, then does it have any implication which you don't want it to have, and that is why the intentional sort of not use of the term? Yeah. So anything on that? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Chaitanya. Nice to see you again after a while. Yeah, maybe we'll meet later on. Yes, so both me and Dr. Jung, in fact, took a conscious decision to stay away from realism, not to characterize our philosophy as realist, and went and adopted Barlinger really as our epistemic framework. The reason would be that we've argued that any theory of monetary value would necessarily have to be a conceptual abstraction, for the simple reason that we contend that monetary systems themselves are constructions. Human constructions doesn't make them any less important. They're just not real in an ontological sense. So the monetary system today can evolve into another monetary system tomorrow. So that's one. So we did not want to bring in realism of metaphysics here. Secondly, because concept formation itself is an epistemic activity. It's an activity. It's not it's not innate as some would have us think. So for these reasons, and if you just take an example, something like Bitcoin, right? So the favorite point of debate for all money guys these days is if a realist. So if I'm a realist and I say Bitcoin has value, then I maybe want to say that Bitcoin is intrinsically valuable. We wanted to move away from this notion. So if I say Bitcoin has value, which I do in fact, then what I mean is that in fact we ascribe value to Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin ought to be ascribed value to. Both of these things, of course, we may disagree about them, but the fact that we can means that it's not an inherent part of Bitcoin itself or of gold, but these are value ascriptions, and therefore we didn't want to get into realism. I hope I've been able to answer that. Maybe not entirely.
No, I think, but I think it's pretty evident that why you guys don't want to be called realist. But I wanted to know that can we call then essentialist paradigm as realist? And if we can call, then you could have, So I thought, was there a intentional attempt to not use realist adjective for Aristotelian paradigm, or it was just?
So the use of the phrase term substantive, we thought would be more accurate and useful, because it allows us to show how the traditional schools locate an inherent substantive layer of value. So that substance of value is in gold, or it's in labor, or it's in the coin, or it's in the shoe. So the substantiveness allows us to locate it in different places. So I think it's that's why it was more appropriate for us. Realism would not convey the nuance, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
But it wouldn't be wrong to say that in my opinion. I'm not sure how Dr. Jung would answer that.
Yeah, we can talk about it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Saraswat.
Hi, thanks, Sushruth. Hi, Aditya. Hi, Chaitanya. It looks like,
Hi,
the
hi.
extended APS, which is, waiting for a long time. Good
Yeah.
to see you.
Good to see you, Lalit.
So, thanks. I'm really happy, the kind of, attachment we have with this book. So let me begin with the last part, which is basically the chapter which you say that why a constructivist framework of monetary value. So Aditya, let me know and let us at least see to this point that isn't it this kind of constructivism or constructionism we are talking about? Isn't it also bringing up a kind of constructed essentialism?
Mm-hmm.
And when we say that, it is actually, as few of the chapters are also bringing up some sort of, very interesting links between Lockean and Aristotelian positions, and then going to the Zimmel's position. So this thought came to my mind that isn't it a kind of constructed essentialism? I think in one of your chapters, you've also hinted with Bailey's account that it is a kind of essentialization of the relations which we have already constructed in the epistemic construction kind of form.
Got it. Okay, thanks, Lalit. Nice to see you. Yes, it feels like no time has passed since 2018.
True, that is so true.
So at a couple of places in the book, we've made a point to emphasize, and we are always paranoid about this, both Dr. Jung and I, is that although we are in fact constructing a formal framework, which not many people like that way of doing philosophy, but it's our approach, it's the approach we've taken. Our formal generic framework is not itself the only way of describing money or monetary value,
right,
and is itself subject to revision. So, if you ask the skeptic if the skeptic's own position should be subject to skepticism, they would say yes. And so this is true with us as well, that our own framework is a result of two things. One, the monetary systems that we have to deal with, that we can observe. And secondly, the tradition of philosophy that gives us these concepts that we can work with. Both of which, which we are indebted to, by the way, as much as we may argue against Aristotle, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, etc. We still take a lot. In fact, if you see in chapter 13, 14, it's a whole heart. In fact, I would say it's a neo-Aristotelian philosophy of monetary value.
Right.
And this is where I would like to bring Dewey in, because fundamentally, my thought is Deweyan. And so, although Dr. Jung may come into it from a different angle, we would agree on this point that when, let's say, Dewey constructs a formal, or when he talks about formal concepts, it's always with the understanding that these formal concepts are meant to shed light on something, but they are not themselves meant to be the only way in which something can be described. So if I describe the relationship between the central bank and that means the RBI and let's say HDFC as one of regulator and regulated, there can also be other ways in which I can describe that same relationship.
Right.
And these relations, which we have to describe, they are not, in a sense, God-given, of course. These descriptions can be essentialized, but we don't want to. One can always say, no, this is the only relation that exists between gold and paper money. But we don't want to say that because we think that the relation between gold and paper money depends on the specific instantiation of which gold standard you're talking about.
Right.
And so we are careful not to essentialize any relationality or any functionality or any substantive aspect.
True. And this is the dynamicity. And I think in one of the places in the books, in this book, you say something about, the ontology is being grounded in the epistemological framework from Zimmel's viewpoint.
Yeah.
And then one thing which is again of importance here to know that how so one subsection says that substance without relation is atomistic.
Yeah.
Right, and relation without substance is unhinged. This
Yeah.
is really interesting, the way you have put it. And I'm also interested to know that what happens when we say at the last of the book says that, the final analysis, it appears that money is therefore not ontologically real in the cosmocentric sense,
Yeah.
but a human and epistemic construct that has, however, come to govern our reality in a manner that it has affected the very fundamental fact of its constructed past from our memory altogether. So sorry, I'm reading it because, there are a few very interesting phrases. So my point is, as we see that, there is a kind of definitely a reciprocity with the past epistemic status and the further epistemic status. So my point is to see this point, that the function is more important than the substance?
No. So we are very clear about this in our minds. Hopefully we've been able to convey it in the book.
Sure, please.
That in the multi-categorical approach, unlike in the Aristotelian approach, we do not lend primacy to any one category. So Aristotle would say that yes, so Aristotle has a list of categories, and he of course includes substance, relation, and function. He has all of them. There's nothing new in this.
Right.
But he gives primacy to substance.
Right.
And only because there is a substance can you have a function and can you have a relation, etc. In our view, the substance arises with the relation and the function. You cannot have substance without relation, and you cannot have function without either of these. Let me give an example. So to take two human beings. So suppose two male human beings, right? Now, we can say that we have two male human beings, but the relation between these two, if there is to be one, has to be determinate. Right? So suppose these two male human beings were brothers of each other.
Right.
Right? Now, the relation of being brothers arises with their substantiveness of being male human beings. Right? So I could, of course, say nothing. So if I am here, I have a brother, in fact. I can also talk about myself as a male human being in another context. That means I am the husband of my wife. So the relationality is different. And that relationality is giving rise to my substantiveness as well, because otherwise all you can say is I exist, which is not saying much. You can't say anything about me without having a determinate relation of me to something else, my community, my family, my work, my surroundings, my biology, whatever it may be.
Right.
So nothing is primary over the other.
So you mean to say that if I use a paperweight as a doorstopper, so it is not having any kind of intrinsicality?
Yes, it has practical uses. It has mass, it has weight, it has physical attributes. But in terms of our description of what it does, that what its function is, that only arises, unlike Aristotle, that only arises once we start to describe
I
its
think
relation.
this is a very interesting thing, because if I just try to portray this to the species problem, and then we say that the species, money is like a species, and then you go for the functional analysis.
Absolutely, Lalit. And much of the thinking in chapter 15, especially when it comes to field variant and range boundness, comes from my thinking about evolution. And so one of the, I think the key points, which a lot of people don't see this, but for someone who's thinking about these issues, is you can think of monetary system evolution in evolutionary terms.
Exactly.
And so if let's say we are moving from a bank-based money system to a bank-based and Bitcoin monetary system, at what stage does it become a new species?
Exactly.
From the current species. So that's one of the things that interests me.
Interesting. So there is one thing which is, again, crisscrossing, and we have to work on evolutionary money kind of thing.
Yeah.
So thanks, sir.
Thank
so
you.
Last point, is money a natural kind or a social kind or what kind it is. We'll discuss later also.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Thank you. Thanks, Shushu.
Professor Ravi Shankar Sharma had sent in his question through chat, so I'll just read that out. He says, I have a general question. How do you view money? Why we attach value to money in the first place? And in brackets, sometimes false money. Is it material or spiritual? Is it a social construct or material or spiritual? Does Aristotle talk about role of emotions attached to value in dealing with money?
Okay, just a second. So we have Aristotle on emotions. We have what is money? Quite a few. Okay. I'll answer the first what is money part. Of course, I gave that our definition of monetary value. So we make a distinction, by the way, between money and monetary value. And we hold this distinction very dear because if some things you can say about money, which you can't say about monetary value and vice versa. So sometimes our what we propound is actually misrepresented if you attach it to money rather than monetary value. So we give a definition of monetary value. What is money as per our definition? If I were to be a little cheeky about it, it's a representation of monetary value. So if you can agree on what monetary value is, then any either physical, digital, or other kind of symbolic representation of that would be your money object. Now, if you take gold coins, for instance, to be money, then they are a symbolic representation of the gold standard monetary system. And this is, by the way, another key insight that we have in our book, which I have not seen specifically made elsewhere, is the distinction between gold as money and the gold standard as a monetary system. Very different thing. So gold as a gold coin is a representation of the gold standard monetary system. Now, in using Simmel for this, money need not be physical either, right? We all know in today's day and age, it's not difficult to imagine. We have digits on our computer screen which stand for our bank balance. So it can also be a digital symbol. It can be a physical symbol as long as it's a symbol of monetary value. But it should, in its most abstracted sense, in its most spiritualized sense rather, in Simmel's terms, it's a symbol of exchangeability itself. So it's the function, we have the function of exchangeability, which is an abstracted notion of moneyness. We're getting a little Platonic here, but suppose you think of moneyness as exchangeability, then the money is nothing but that which symbolizes exchangeability. Now, whether that is Bitcoin, whether that is bank money on your screen, whether that's a note or whether that's cowrie shells or gold coins or something else is entirely an accident of history, according to us. Does Aristotle talk about the emotions of money? Not really. He hardly talks about money, really. So you have to tease out anything he does. He talks about the ethics of money when he talks about the household management. So that's the ancient Greek notion of the economy. But he doesn't really talk about the emotions of money. Not something maybe that an aristocratic Greek male had to really worry too much about, I think. So maybe it didn't concern him too much.
He says thanks on the chat. Yeah. So Pujarini?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. First one is, what is the specific philosophical parameter, unlike the economical framework money? Because when you talk about the digital or cryptocurrency like the Bitcoin, and my second concern is that, except this conceptual framework, how could you understand the monetary value from the philosophical perspectives? Because this conceptual framework is equally highlighted also in other fields of discipline. So, so I'm wondering, are you using this conceptual framework in the sense of pragmatic value? Because you have also mentioned about the telos. So what does it mean? Could you please clarify it? Thank you.
Thank you, Pujarini, right?
Yes.
Thanks for the questions. I'll answer the second one first and then maybe ask for some clarity on the first one. When we offer a conceptual framework, of course, sociologists do this, anthropologists do this, lots of scholars do this. We are working with that to mean that a framework of concepts at the highest level of generality that is possible with the concepts at hand. And this is and I'm the first person to say this, a very old school way of thinking about philosophy, but it's also a pragmatist way of thinking about philosophy, where we are constructing a framework that should ideally be able to subsume or describe all other frameworks as well, without being completely meaningless. It shouldn't be so diluted and so general that it doesn't say anything. And so you can read the specifics of this in chapters 12 to 15 of the book, where we offer a framework, and I give examples within that of monetary examples and other examples of how to think about it. But a conceptual framework is just that, an abstracted system of concepts that fit together, within which you have to plug monetary ideas. And once those are plugged in, it gives you a way of thinking about how monetary value emerges. So, for instance, we would hope that our philosophical framework is also able to incorporate, because we would want that, research from anthropology and sociology as aspects of the framework. And how to do this, you'd have to go through the chapters to think about how we can plug those concepts into our framework. But to give you an idea, the idea of community itself can be a substance instance. So can be an instantiation of substance within our conceptual framework, as can a gold coin. So something as small as a gold coin, or something as pervasive or nebulous, or as large as community. Not great words, but community can also be a substance instantiation. And with your first question, could you please repeat that? I didn't quite understand.
What is the specific like philosophical parameter, unlike the economical framework money, when you talk about the digital currency or like cryptocurrency, example of Bitcoin?
Right. So what we hope to have done is give people a way to even talk about Bitcoin as being money, A, and as being part of the global monetary system, B, through our framework. Now, there are different philosophies of money depending on which system they're looking at. So when you look at the dominant monetary system these days, it's what I call the bank-based monetary system, the system that we all live in for the most part. The philosophical underpinnings of this are different from, let's say, the gold standard monetary system. So often the philosophical underpinnings are an extension of the actual monetary system that philosophy is talking about. So it would have to, I think, be specific. What we have done is offer a general framework that hopefully applies to various monetary systems.
Okay, like when you're talking about this, like the generic understanding of the value of money, like I'm just like thinking, like when we are using that like the statement like money is time and time is money. So are you like thinking in that sense, like?
No, so we have so I would refer you to I'll refer you to page 120 if you have the book. If you don't, get in touch with me later. I'll send this image to you.
Okay.
Where we've sketched out a system of concepts, which we then can populate with various monetary ideas. So it's not one phrase. It's not like a principle that time is money or money is time, but it's a system of concepts that includes substance, relation, and function, and various relational aspects between them. I won't be able to explain too much because it'll get too technical to explain in a short time. So I would highly suggest that you actually take a look at that chapter.
Sure, thank you.
Professor Kulkarni?
Yeah, so my question is this, basically, that if you look at what you call philosophy of money, whether it is Aristotle or later on, Marx or Zimmel, or more recently, you have a book like What Money Cannot Buy, right? By Michael Sandel, who's also a philosopher. So in each of them, their understanding of money, gives you some way in which you not only, which helps you to understand not only what money does or what it is all about, say what you call the ontology of money, or epistemology, or how to make sense of it, of what it does, but also there is a way in which it helps you to critique the role of money in society, whether it is Aristotle's critique of usury, or of course Marx's very famous critique of fetishism, and so on, down to this book that I mentioned, Michael Sandel's. I think Rimmel also is worried about how other forms of valuation are being marginalized if money becomes the main way of measuring or capturing or representing value, etc. So what is it that does your kind of, and use, because you hold what you call a classical or traditional conception of philosophy, right? I mean, you don't have a positivist approach to it, and so therefore it should be an integrated approach, understanding. And even though at one point of time you may, for the sake of theoretical convenience or clarity, or as a kind of prolegomena, you may emphasize the zero in on the ontological epistemological aspect. Surely it has to open a way to some kind of a critique. So does it do that, and how, if so?
Yes, thank you, Professor Kulkarni. Thanks for the question and for being here for this. Two things. Firstly, yes, this book is entirely ontological, epistemological, and it does throw up certain roots of inquiry that we want to explore, that we have, of course, discussed, but we want to explore in more detail, which we have not yet done. So anything that I say about this right now is basically reflections on it. But one way which you can think about the doors that this opens on the ethical/political front is fundamentally, if our critique of the substantive tradition is taken forward, then various existing critiques, like the Marxist critique, like the Aristotelian critique, or like the Aristotelian or Marxist ethical positions, are shaken slightly. So it has some effect on existing ethical theories because of shaking the grounds on which those theories rest. That is its so-called negative or critical route that it opens up. Whether you agree with it or not, of course, that's different, but that's one route. The second route is to talk more in more depth on money in relation to bondage and freedom. And this is, I think, the primary ethical principle that will drive the work that comes out of this book. It'll be the primary ethical question, rather. Because if you take Simmel, as for all his misgivings about money, as the one who most champions the freedomization of monetary life, versus, let's say, David Graeber and his debt theory, who relates the emergence of money and debt money with bondage. You have a tension here. And I think this is an important question for philosophers of money to deeply think about, the relation of money to freedom, because in one way, money is obviously something that engenders more freedom as opposed to fixed property, because I can take my money and go anywhere. Think about this, for instance. Someone who was caught in Ukraine during the war can fly out, go to the US. I mean, they can't literally, but suppose they could fly out and go to the US. They've lost all their fixed property, but they have all their digital money. Take this one step further, Bitcoin. Even if you are sanctioned, the Bitcoin ecosystem does not care about your sanctions for the most part. And so you're completely free in a property sense with your money. So this is something that money gives you, which non-money property does not. So this is the freedom enhancing aspect of money. On the other hand, there's the tension, and this is to do with the debt, usury, interest aspects of money, that it also binds you. So what we call debt slavery, or predatory lending. And so I think this is something that we will explore, and there is bearings of our ontology on these questions. But I won't want to go more into this at the moment, because it would be completely half-baked ideas that I'd be throwing out. I hope that sheds some light.
Thanks for that. I don't want to take much of your time, but just very quickly, it was already said by, I think, another person earlier, I think Professor Chakrabarti perhaps, that Marx too has actually definitely a relational understanding of money, right? And so I don't think that's unique to your approach. And then secondly, because you say that it is monetary value, and you talk of represent how it is represented, and so systems of representation, you make those kinds of distinctions. Now, I was just wondering if you looked at literature, the domain of literature, where there are very interesting ways in which monetary value and representations of monetary value are portrayed in different. For example, very quickly, what comes to my mind is this famous short story. I don't know if you know about it, by Isaac, Singer, I.B. Singer.
No.
The Son from America.
Okay.
So I think there's a range of such literary narratives that perhaps you could look at, because that's a site. This kind of literature is a site where it's kind of where there is a mediation between your kind of philosophizing and what social science does.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, although we haven't dealt with it in the sense of being subsumed under our thought, or not subsumed, rather engaged with as part of our thought. It is something that I look at, especially in the course that I used to teach on this. But I'll take a look at this this short story as well. Especially literature is especially helpful when it comes to pinpointing points of stress, which is always fertile ground for philosophizing. With regard to, I'll just quickly address this. We don't make the claim that relationality or functionality is something that we bring to the picture. The entire system as a whole that we construct in the final chapters is unique to us, most definitely. But relationality and functionality are not. In fact, if we want to go back, relationality we've taken from Aristotle. So it's as old as Aristotle, really. So we don't want to claim to have brought that in ourselves. Yeah. Thanks.
I know we have overshot time, but Abhiram has been patiently waiting. So I hope Aditya will be kind enough to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, sir. I am Abhiram. Am I audible?
Yes,
so I am a sociology PhD student working on the social networks and interactions of cryptocurrency community.
Oh, wow.
I'm just back from my field, actually. Okay. So I have a lot of things to talk about. Like I haven't even spoke with my supervisors, Dr. Sam and Dr. Chakrabarti. But I have a few questions. There is how do you conceptualize these two terms, like centralization and decentralization, are like very important terms related with this Bitcoin and cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
So this cryptocurrency is offering an opportunity to circumvent the formal restrictions or the formal economy system run by the government. So how do you philosophically conceptualize this opportunity of circumventing the formal economy? And the sociological literature, the existing sociological literature has explained that cryptocurrency is not an automated form of money. It has the community backing, and the community engagement and interactions are so important for the maintenance of this cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
So, so from my field, what I understood is that people are getting an opportunity to participate in different sorts of communities which have their own currencies and which sell their own kind of commodities. And in the formal economy, they don't have access to gadgets and like some weapons, drugs, or anything. So people have access to these things if they are part of the other communities, and like they have the opportunity to circumvent taxes and stuff. So how do you conceptualize this opportunity? of restricting the formal economy.
What is that word? How do you conceptualize this?
So philosophically, how do you conceptualize like the opportunity to circumvent the formal economy through
okay.
this cryptocurrency?
Okay, the opportunity to, okay. Let me first say one thing. I think this is also to Professor Kulkarni's point. I'm in fact currently writing a book on, a book of essays really on money, Bitcoin, and political philosophy. So talking about Bitcoin specifically, but also some cryptocurrencies, non-Bitcoin crypto. But from the point of view of political philosophy specifically, because most people in this space don't quite understand it. They only come to it from Austrian economics and its associated political politics. But that's something I'm working on, so I'll share that once that's done. How do I think about this? So firstly, I'll say this, I am a proponent of Bitcoin. I am not of all cryptocurrencies, but definitely of Bitcoin. I see great value in Ethereum. I see great value in decentralization because I feel that not having one point of failure means that currencies cannot be corrupted or co-opted by one particular organization, country, person, state, agency, etc. So I think from a classical enlightenment political philosophy perspective, this is the dream, because this is individuality taken to its core. But the interesting thing you brought in again is decentralization, although it may seem individualistic, has this component of community, because the community is as strong as the individual and vice versa in the crypto example. So I see it as extremely fascinating. One is the fact that it has survived, I think is almost a miracle, because Bitcoin could have been killed in 100 different ways. So it's a great experiment in decentralization for whatever it's worth, for whatever the disadvantages it may have. But my thinking on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency with regard to circumventing government regulation and stuff like that comes from the perspective of political philosophy. Because my thinking on crypto is very clear. There is no such thing as intrinsic value, ontologically speaking. So Bitcoin clearly has value, and I can demonstrate that in various ways. The easiest way to say is go on CoinMarketCap. You need to pay $25,000 to get it. Obviously, it has some value, right? So that's not even an issue for me. What's more interesting is to see how Bitcoin will get incorporated into the traditional monetary system. And the touchstone for this, and I think this is not something that people have clearly communicated, is the touchstone in the current monetary system, and this can speak to your taxation. Something is money only if it can seamlessly enter and exit your bank. This is important. And if it can seamlessly enter and exit your bank account, then the government will accept payment of that. Are you getting this? Taxation can only be in legal tender. Legal tender today is bank money. If Bitcoin gets incorporated into the banking system, it is pretty much part of the system. That is a fascinating topic for me. I think regulation will come in and do away with the ability to circumvent lots of things, but we need to see how this plays out. I think it will take 3 to 5 years before we have clarity on this.
I actually have a subsequent question, sir. So you have written about history of money. So how about the coexistence of this kind of money, like say the barter system and or the fiat currencies together, and now the cryptocurrency and the like digital representation of cryptocurrency? So the payment methods, they are all like so now there is a proliferation of payment methods and proliferation of money. So how you understand the coexistence of all this?
I think our framework, and I think for someone like you should definitely pick up the book and maybe even discuss parts of it with me. The framework that we have presented is most powerful when it tries to bring together various aspects and see how they fit together. I think that's one of it, and it also throws up points of tension. It's through this framework I can think about what would make Bitcoin monetary money, and what would give it monetary value, and where would the point of tension be, and which I just spoke about. So pick that up. But just a little clarification, we have not presented a history of money. we've presented a history of the philosophy of money, different thing. So essentially how philosophers have conceptualized money over time. Yeah, but I think they will coexist. I don't think cryptocurrencies are going to throw away the others and displace them. It's going to be coexistence. Like with most social change, it is conservative in that it conserves aspects of the past while changing certain aspects. I don't think it will be revolutionary in that it will completely do away with it. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. This shift from relational, substantive, and like functional forms of money and the social context at which it shifts its format. This is interesting. I'll definitely get in touch with you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Right. So thank you so much, Aditya, and thanks everyone for attending. We hope to read more of your work, and maybe we can invite you once more sometime later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sushruth. Thank you, everyone, old faces and new faces, for coming here, spending time listening to what we have to say. I'll let Dr. Jung know that our time was not wasted, and I'll be happy to speak to you all again. And please let me know when there are other speakers I'd really like to participate.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.